Bruchim Aboyim, welcome to everyone for the 12th in the continuing series of shiurim on the parts of the guide, the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam, which deal with the general issue of what is usually termed negative theology. And I hope everyone had a happy Hanukkah, and we're going to, we took from an undisclosed location in Yerushalayim. We were not present for a week. At least we were present, but not on camera. And so we're going to, Yetz Hashem, recommence the shiurim lectures, and I think the schedule is about 20, so this is number 12, so we're actually hitting a crescendo. Now, we're up to Perek Samech, chapter 60, which in the Schwartz edition is on page 152. And it's clear that chapter 60 is a pivotal chapter. Why is it pivotal? Because it really doesn't have much to do with anything that came before that. It doesn't have anything much to do with anything that comes afterwards. Namely, that through chapter 59, the Rambam develops the concept of negative theology. What is it? And he brings ideas from Chazal, etc., etc. From chapter 61, the Rambam actually goes into what you would call a history of negative theology, from biblical times until Chazal, I guess until the time of the Rambam. And that's going to commence actually a section in which the Rambam is going to actually deal with the history of ideas, anthropology, etc., that's coming events. But chapter 60 is an interesting chapter. It's nishtahir, nishtahir, not here, not there. The Rambam is basically giving a warning to people that if they don't get it right, they didn't get it at all. And the question is going to loom, why is the Rambam giving us this warning over here? Okay? So we'll go through the Rambam right now, and then one of the reasons that I get this introduction is that we should have in the back of our minds that obviously this chapter has to be understood not only for the content, but for its geographical location within the chapters of the Moreh Nevuchim. As we know, the Rambam himself has pointed out in his introduction that the order of the chapters is going to be very, very important too. This is actually a klal in the Mishnah Torah, but the Rambam says explicitly that this is an important key to understanding his messages in the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, the Rambam in Perek Samech, once again, on the Schwartz edition, page 152, Perek Samech, chapter 60, says the Rambam, Perek Zeh Roitzani Laham Shilcha Mishalem Asher Be'emtzuusam Teitiv Yesel Etfoses Achoy V'Lahabis Ta'ora V'Yidei Shlilos V'Tabel L'Sloid B'Lahamim V'Toram Chiyuvim L'Gavi Yis'alet. So the Rambam says, this Perek is basically chizuk. The Rambam says, I'm going to give you Mishalem metaphors, you're going to make arguments, or perhaps metaphors, they're going to more enable you to understand the Rambam calls it the chayva, the obligation of understanding God in negative terms, right? The table is slide, and therefore, as a result of this, or maybe consciously, a person will actually be less inclined. Actually, slide means to be burnt. In other words, to be taken aback from believing that one can actually give positive virtues towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So see, the Rambam is actually, you would use the term shtab, he's being very, very strong in this parak. Let's assume that a person is aware of the fact that there's a ship, something exists called there's a certain thing that exists, which is actually in fact a ship. But it really doesn't know anything about a ship. In other words, for example, someone tells you that there's a ship out there. You don't see, and you have no idea what a ship is. So you don't know what a ship is. Is it a noun? Is it an adjective? So first of all, we find out it's not an adjective, or it's not a mode, right? Right? It refers to actually an object. So first of all, someone finds out, a ship, it's not a natural element in the earth. It's not ore, or it's not ground, gravel. And someone finds out it's not an animal. A ship is not an animal. It's not a plant. It's not something which is which somehow is naturally connected to the ground. For example, it's not something which has a very plain, straight dimension. Like, for example, it's not like a plank, or it's not like a gate. We find out it's not a ball, because it doesn't have circular ships. We don't have circular ships. We find out that it's not carved into something. We find out it's not round. It's not like ribs that come out from a backbone. We find out that also too is not closed, but rather it's hollow inside. So says the Rambam, in other words, he says that it's clear the last person who's gone through all these steps, right? He finds that the ship is actually not connected to the ground, it's not a living thing, and it's hollow, and it's not, right? So it's clear the last person, right, has a better understanding of what a ship is than either the previous understanding. I mean, the guy who first asked the question, thought maybe it's a rock, or maybe it's a. So the person who knows that it's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's not connected to the ground. It's not circular, completely circular. It's hollow inside. It's not it's not like a plank of wood. So the Rambam says the last person clearly has a better understanding of it than all of those people who preceded him. It's like this. So this person, right, would basically be, epistemologically speaking, this person is on the same level, right, as if someone would say, in other words, if I say to a person, what's a ship? So I say to them, a ship is basically composed of planks of wood that somehow that create an object which is hollow inside. So basically, this person who arrived negatively to the same conclusion, it would be the same thing as I would have given a positive description of the ship as being sort of like this hollow wooden object. Okay? In other words, coming to a negative understanding of the ship by eliminating possibilities which are not true, this person arrived at the same point, epistemologically, as the person as I would have said in one sentence. A ship is an object made of wood, planks of wood that are put together that have a hollow inside. Okay, now, now, says the Rambam, if you look at I don't expect people to memorize the whole list of questions, but if you go back, if you're looking inside, the Rambam says you will see that clearly those people who ask the questions, and like if you go back, the ignorance just gets larger and larger. In other words, in fact, the first person doesn't even know what a ship is. He just knows the name ship. He doesn't know anything about a ship. Okay, so says the Rambam. So what do we see? So the Rambam, I gave you a mashal. This is a metaphor. So the Rambam, so this is the way you get closer to knowing God. Because what the Rambam doing? The Rambam is saying is, it's possible to know about something by a series of negations. That's what the Rambam is saying. So the Rambam So that's the way to approach an understanding of God. The more you negate, the closer you get to an understanding of what God is. That's what the Rambam is saying. Okay? So the Rambam says from this standpoint, there are people who've come very close to God. That's very interesting. What do you mean, people have gone close to God? I mean, how close can you get to Kadosh Baruch Hu if it's just through negations? But in other words, that's what the Rambam is deeming to be close, namely that you've negated more and more. But some people are distant from God, very much so. So that's not close or far. The idiots think that far is some type of proximity. Understand this thoroughly, says the Rambam. You should be happy with this. Because now you have the way, the path of getting close to God. I guess the Rambam felt that after concluding that you only see negative things about God, some people were rather upset about this. So the Rambam is saying that you should be happy with this. If you want to go on this path, this is the place you should go. That's what I'm saying. Now, so what about those people who try to come close to God via positive attributes? Okay? This is a very big danger in that. In other words, says the Rambam, there's a very big danger in trying to approach God through positive attributes. Why? Because even if, right? In other words, even if we could say that God has this shleimus, its meaning is much different than our understanding of the shleimus. In other words, even attributing to God a perfection, because as we'll see, we do attribute to God perfections, but the perfection does not in any way match or is not in any way commensurable with our notion of that perfection. In other words, we're deluding ourselves. We're invoking a perfection which our concept of perfection has absolutely nothing to do with that perfection which you associate with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. In other words, the perfection is only, the term is only applied. Right? The term is only applied. They'll use the same term. That's called shituf. But the fact is that the concept is meaningless. In other words, the human notion of perfection is meaningless when it applies to God. The term, the language you can use, but the word is empty of meaning. As we explain. Says the Rambam, because of this, even by attributing perfection to God, to understand His perfection, one has to go about through a path of negations, which we spoke about in the previous chapter. When you speak about God's knowledge, we describe His knowledge. It's one knowledge. It's a knowledge that doesn't increase or doesn't get smaller. He knows many things without having new, right? So says the Rambam, when you say God knows, because in fact that's what the Rambam's going to say in chapter 68, 69 later was that, God's essence is His knowledge. But the knowledge has nothing to do with human knowledge. So what are you saying ultimately? That if you spoke about God's knowledge, His perfect knowledge, His knowledge of things that you cannot say His knowledge increases or decreases. There's no new knowledge to God. So what are you saying? You're using the word knowledge, but the word knowledge has absolutely nothing to do with with the way we use knowledge. In other words, it's a word, but it has we have no understanding of the meaning of this word when applied to God. God's existence. In other words, that's what I'm saying too. We speak of God's existence. When we think of existence, the way we think of other things exist, then this existence has no meaning with respect to God. It can only be understood. God's existence can be only understood in negative sense. In other words, basically, when we attribute to God attributes, and these are attributes that we normally use, attributing the same attributes to God basically has no meaning whatsoever, because these attributes we attribute to God are not in any way commensurable with the usage of these attributes when we attribute to things that that we usually use. ואז מרבס הגן בעבודה זו ישיטה ולא שום דבר אחר, שכן כל נושא יש בלי ספק נשואים ושניים מבחינת הגדרסה, כי משמעות הנושא שם משמעות הנשוא עליו. It's like this. Now, so what's the Rambam saying? The Rambam is saying is, right, that speaking about God in positive terms will mean ultimately that we're applying terms in a way which is meaningless. Meaningless. In your שהמחייב תורם לא יסע לאידו מסי קרוי, או שהוא משתף או סגוסו הוא בשינוי משהו, אלא אומר אני הוא שלוש בציסו אלא בתוך אמונוסוי בבלי להתקם בכך. Says the Rambam a very strong statement. Says the Rambam, I say that if a person attributes positive attributes to God, it's not that he doesn't have enough of an apprehension of God, right? Not that, like, you know, he's a different apprehension of God. In other words, be the Yevon, like Epistari, the apprehension is far. It's not the highest level. But says the Rambam, I say more so. He's denying God's existence. In other words, by using attributes of God, what he's doing is he's negating God's existence. It's a very strong term. In other words, the Rambam is not saying that attributing attributes to God are not the best way of describing God. But there's a better way of understanding and describing God. What Rambam is saying is describing attributes to God is in fact atheism. It's denying God, denying his existence. Unknowingly. In other words, the person has created something which doesn't exist. For example, I'll give you an example. A person knows something about something, but doesn't know something else about something. A person knows that a human being is an animal. He's a living thing. But what? But he's unaware of the fact that he has seichel. That he has intellect. So in other words, says the Rambam, a person would think that a person is an animal and not know that he has seichel, not intellect. So he missed the point. He's not a lesser person. He's not a person whatsoever. So says the Rambam, so if the truth of God, we're on page 154, so if the truth of God is that he cannot have, in other words, there's no multiplicity, no plurality. In other words, if a person attributes to God something, and a consequence of that is that God ends up, right, being less unified. In other words, attributing aspects to God implies de facto that God could be in one state or another state. Says the Rambam, it's not God. It's not God. It's like not knowing anything about God. It's zero. Okay? So that's what the Rambam says. It's like a person attributing something to God, but really he's attributing to some other object, not to God whatsoever. Okay? So, what's the Rambam saying? It's a very interesting thing here in the Rambam. He's saying it's all or nothing. Attributing positive statements about God is not a lower understanding or lower apprehension of God. It's not God. You're speaking about something else. You made up something. Okay? And this is the difference. It's like this. In other words, for example, usually when I understand something about an object, so therefore, I know something about the object. For example, he says in the brackets here, first, a person sees something and it's bitter. He thinks it's sweet. In other words, says the Rambam, at least I know, in other words, it has a taste. In other words, the person, right, this coffee that I'm drinking, which is very good, now I think it's delicious, it's sweet. Someone might think it's bitter. If I think it's bitter and it's really sweet, okay, I got it wrong, but at least I know that it has a taste. The coffee has a taste, not tasteless. What happens if I taste that it's 6 ounces? Any omesh mitzaliyat was a double shana kvishu. El omesh inu makiris mitzias atam. It means my usage of taste is meaningless. It's absurd. How does this taste, Meir Triebitz? It tastes 6 ounces. So what have I said? I've used the word in a way in which there's an absurd meaning to it, and therefore, ipso facto, I have absolutely no idea what I'm I mean, I have absolutely what I'm talking about. Says the Rambam is very, very subtle, and explain it. So says the Rambam, so therefore, in accordance with this, the consequence of this, says the Rambam, the person does not perceive God properly, in other words, in the proper way. Right? The person does not apprehend God in the proper way. And as far, right? Right? And he understands them only in terms of positive attributes and not in the negative attributes, which is already been, which is proven. Rambam is going to prove this in Chelik Pei. If a person negates less, she has less of an idea. But if you give it a positive attribute, and your idea is Hashem greater, he only knows the word God. The Metzias, the essence or the existence of God is just words, G-O-D. That's what it is. He's speaking about something that doesn't exist. In other words, he created an illusion for himself. There's something called G-O-D which doesn't exist. It's like the coffee tastes with a certain dimension. You fooled yourself. You destroyed. You fooled yourself, and it's a dangerous self-delusion. It's like, it's as if, for example, he's calling it. He's giving a name to something, to a vacuum, to nothingness. Because there's nothing like this. In other words, if I give a positive attribute to God, speak about him knowing, and he knows in the sense that I know something, there is nothing that exists like that. I've made something up. I've made up a new creature. Was the kind of says the Rambam, and this is the best metaphor he's given, the strongest metaphor. Was a symbol to Shem appeal. A person heard there's an elephant. There's something called an elephant. What's an elephant? Now, he heard that it's a living thing. He wasn't know what it's about. You know, you've never been to India, never been to Africa, never been to the zoo. So the person says, you know what it is? It's alive. It has 1 foot. It has 3 wings, I guess, that let it lives in the sea. It has a transparent body. It looks like a person. And he speaks like a person. Now, what is this thing? It doesn't exist. Sometimes it flies in the air. Sometimes it swims. I guess it goes in the air, right? And says the Rambam, what do you think? You described him a little bit about an elephant? Basically, he's made something else which is false. It has no, it's not rooted in the reality. He's spoken about something that doesn't exist. He called an elephant as something, his description of an elephant is something which doesn't exist. He described nothing. Just like the sandbird, so that's, says the Rambam like this, page 155. God exists. Has been proven that he exists. The Rambam proves this at the beginning of Chelik Beis. And of course, not only does he exist, but he's incorporeal and cannot be described in any using any mundane description. Asha Atmos is a pshuta chod b'tzis kamu Atmos balas Torah min yonim achem adveikim bo harei ze dava bilti motzei b'shim oifen k'vi shehucha moifses. But therefore, apparently there's not positive attributes. This has also been proven. The chedim nema she'atmos zois hamachud elo lamasho Atmos sheish bo in yonim berupen asher b'hem hi maturim harei she'enu nach munak zal hedem zal hela. In other words, basically to describe God in a way which can't be described is basically to create a fiction which doesn't exist. He's born in evil cases sakana. So see what a danger there is. How much the danger is to give God positive attributes. So therefore, the descriptions that in fact that appear in books of Revelations or books of prophets, all they're doing is coming to what? To bring a person, right? To direct a person towards the perfection of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. In other words, bring us to understand God better, or tell you Pa'ulas and others in men, or they come described as acts, like we explained. Okay, so basically like this. Let's summarize and come to the Rambam. What is the Rambam saying? The Rambam is saying a very simple thing, is that a positive attribute is not a partial and perhaps inadequate description of God. A positive attribute is basically a fiction which doesn't exist. Attributing to God attributes in any positive way, using attributes which have our understanding of these attributes, is basically describing something which has absolutely no existence. It doesn't exist whatsoever. It's like speaking about an elephant that flies in the air and swims with its wings and has 1 foot. The Rambam uses a very, very vivid description of something which obviously can't exist. Which means the Rambam understands, very interestingly enough, is the following thing. That, and we can even raise this, is that the Rambam understands that there's no point in thinking that when you educate a person about God, then first the person should try to use positive descriptions, and then afterwards use negative descriptions. In other words, you can't compromise on this educationally. A person, like the Rambam says, a person has to get himself in the habit of using only negative descriptions. This is what the Rambam is saying. In other words, there's no point in educating any person, or in other words, sometimes like the Rambam says, the Rambam writes in the beginning of Moreh Nevuchim that sometimes when you explain something to the person, the Rambam explains why there are steals, contradictions in the Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam also says sometimes when you explain something to a person, you have to explain it in a simple way, which might be what? Not be totally true, but in other words, sometimes you have to explain something in steps. The person cannot grasp the concept completely. So this is because you have to go by steps. In other words, you explain it in a simple way, which is not completely accurate, but it's enough of a description that a person has the base upon which you can build later on. Says the Rambam, you can't do this by attributing to God positive attributes. You have to begin directly with negativity. In other words, only negation, right, has any connection with reality. Attributing to God a positive perfection, right, is basically creating an illusion. It's an act of self-delusion. It has no grasp of any aspect or reality or partial reality of Kodesh Baruch Hu, and it's dangerous. That's what I'm saying. Now, first of all, this is actually a little bit strange, because we've already mentioned that the Chumash itself uses anthropomorphic images of God, descriptions of God. The Rambam has spoken about this in chapter 26. We've already mentioned this. And the Rambam himself mentioned that it was necessary for the Chumash to describe God in supposedly anthropomorphic terms only because people would otherwise not believe in God. So why is the Rambam turning around and saying, it's a psychotic, it's dangerous, you're deluding people, you're saying things that don't exist? According to the Rambam, the Chumash describes the hand of God. A person will believe that literally, which according to the Rambam, simple people who are not sophisticated will have to believe that literally in order that they should believe in God whatsoever. According to the Rambam, that's dangerous. That's not the way to educate a person. It's an illusion. So how does the Rambam square this
pedagogical.
This pedagogical, right?
Technique.
Understanding, right? With other things he said in the Moreh Nevuchim. That's number one. Number two, it seems to me that why is the Rambam saying it here? This is the question I raised previously. In other words, he says it here in chapter 60. Until chapter 60, the Rambam has elaborated on the reasons that I cannot assign to God any positive attributes. Fine. And in chapter 61, the Rambam is going to speak about what's the Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei, and his Rambam is going to speak about the sources or the Makoros, the places in Scripture where in fact actually God's God's negative theological essence is actually being alluded to or described. Why is this over here? Why is this chapter over here? Why the Rambam should have put this chapter maybe at the very beginning or maybe at the very, very end, right? Why, in fact, actually is the Rambam putting it over here? So we can make many different types of guesses and everything. I would say the following thing. It's very, very interesting is that beginning in chapter 61, the Rambam is going to begin speaking about what we would call positive attributes of God. Now, how can the Rambam do something like this? But for example, in chapter 61, he can speak about the Shem HaMefuresh, the explicit name of God, which the letters of which are Yud Kei Vav Kei, and then I'm going to speak about what this means and how this was passed on, what it means in the Chumash. In fact, all of this is going to climax in actually chapter 68, 69, where the Rambam is going to speak about God's essence, His knowledge, His will. He's going to speak about God's essence. The Rambam is actually, in a certain sense, going to contradict himself. Well, contradict himself by speaking about God's will. I mean, he hasn't contradicted himself because he says his will is different than other will, but he's asking him to speak about God's essence. In other words, now that I've convinced you that it's wrong to think about God in positive terms, and my understanding of God epistemologically can only be in a negative sense, then how am I going to commence in chapter 61 by starting to speak about in a positive sense? So I claim the Rambam is saying in chapter 60, when I speak about positive attributes, I'm giving you a warning. When you think about these positive attributes, don't try to begin thinking of them, apprehending them in a direct positive way. In other words, the Rambam is basically giving a warning to his reader before he commences with chapters 61 through 69. He's saying like this: I'm going to now speak about the usage of positive attributes of God, beginning with the Chumash, and at the end he's going to speak about the philosopher's understanding of God's essence and His knowledge. Do not try to grasp the ideas that I'm going to explain to you by first trying to understand them in an actual positive way, and think by that after a while you get used to them, you'll think about it in a negative sense way. The Rambam's giving you a warning. It's very dangerous to do like that. So what the Rambam is doing here in chapter 60, he's giving the reader a warning, right? Do not trespass, but tread very carefully. In other words, meaning as such, I want to claim there's no contradiction to chapter 26 either. Amaratzim, I'm not going to get this part of Nevuchim anyway.
That's not a
necessity. But the person, the reader, my reader, who I'm directing him very carefully and very subtly to understanding very difficult concepts in 61, 69, which I'm going to actually use attributes of God in a positive sense. I'm giving you a warning. Do not delude yourself by thinking that these concepts can be understood in any practical or any significant positivistic fashion. That's what the Rambam is saying over here. And I think this I think this actually makes a lot of sense. What do you say?
Kirosh is just
Yeah.
very in one sentence. Again, the question is, why does Rambam allow to teach children positive attributes of God, and here he denies?
He doesn't allow. He says the Chumash used it because otherwise the people would be atheistic. That's what Rambam says.
And here he says it's completely negative.
Right. Yeah.
And the resolution is in one sentence?
The resolution is that since from chapter 61 to 69, I'm going to be speaking about positive attributes of God, I'm going to be using them. Do not think that to understand the things that I'm going to be talking about, you will have to have some type of a recourse, but thinking about it in a positive way, and only then switching over to the negative side. In other words, when I use positive attributes, when I speak about God's positive attributes, do not delude yourself in thinking that one could have a partial grasp upon them by understanding them in a positive way. In other words, it's a warning for the upcoming chapters.
So the upcoming chapters are on mashal, but don't make the nimshal?
Right. Right. You know, you have to think very, very abstractly.
So
yeah.
So in other words, God doesn't even have positive attributes, even analogically.
Right.
Even at the level of analogy,
Right.
we're theologically forbidden.
Right. That's it. Now.
And the Chumash uses it because...
Okay. Right now.
Because we're not talking about it.
Now, the fact is, right. The fact is that we could have understood the Rambam in another way. This contradiction I'm raising. I mean, why is the Chumash use positive attributes of God? So, the Rambam in chapter 61 is going to commence upon really I call the history of negative theology beginning with the Chumash. Uses of the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is the Shem Mefurash. The Rambam we could argue for the Rambam, saying the following thing. Namely, as the Rambam makes this explicit in the section of Moreh Nevuchim, in the third chelik, where he speaks about the Tamei Mitzvahs, the Rambam says that clearly the Jews who came in Mitzrayim were idolatrous. But they were people who were steeped in idolatrous culture. In fact, the Rambam is going to actually say this in chapter 61 to a certain extent. They were steeped in idolatrous culture. They had no recourse to any type of sophisticated thinking. The Rambam is actually going to actually make a point of this, that it was Moshe Rabbeinu, that's the Ekya Sha'ekya, the name of God that Moshe Rabbeinu has to deliver to the Jewish people, informing them, of a monotheism, which transcends, idolatrous notions. So, the Rambam might be saying here is that, in other words, for these people who were idolatrous, perhaps, giving God positive attributes, they just had to believe in God. But for the audience that I'm addressing to, and the Rambam has told us in his introduction clearly who's addressing it was a person who's been schooled in physics, who's been schooled in philosophy, right? Then certainly, right, for you, right, you don't need recourse to what the Chumash, the Chumash use of the terms are historic, have historical context, historicism. But the reader doesn't have recourse. Doesn't have recourse to this because obviously he's not steeped in the same type of culture. And then for you it's a danger. For you it's a danger. In other words, the heter that was given, quote unquote heter, that the Chumash used these terms are not applicable to. That's good enough to say that in the Rambam too. In fact, I would say that probably both are true. I don't think there's an inherent contradiction between either of these resolutions of the question that I raised.
There's enough kamina though.
There's a big nafkamina. There's a big nafkamina, right? There's a big nafkamina. The question is, and I mentioned that the reason for taking the second explanation I'm giving is because of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam calls him a min. The person, in other words, calls him a min. So the kasha I asked, I think last shiur or 2 shiurim ago, was how come a min of the Moreh Nevuchim would say is not? The answer is, in that time of history, people were steeped in idolatrous culture. People are not steeped in idolatrous trust, and there's no reason for a person to think that God has a hand, bisman hazeh, which means there has been a aliyas haderos. In other words, civilization has gone forward, informing us more of monotheism, which the Rambam understands.
And what would Rambam say about the Gemara, which also is full of anthropomorphism? When Rav and Abaya, when Nachman asks them where is God, they point to the ceiling or the sky.
Yeah.
Is that not giving God a body?
I don't offhand know what the Rambam says about that Gemara, But it could be when they point to the sky, it doesn't mean it's in the sky as opposed to the earth. What the saying is that it's beyond the world. In other words, the Rambam could clearly learn that Gemara in other words, that Gemara is coming to teach us that a little child understands that God cannot be described by physical terms, and by pointing to the sky above, what they're saying is that he's not physical. That's a child's way of saying he's not physical.
That's negative theology.
Right. Negative theology for, how old is it, like 6 years?
Doesn't say.
Negative theology for a 6-year-old kid. That's the way he understands it.
So it's going to say to a kid today that God is in the sky is kfir according to Rambam.
If I say he's mamish floating in the sky, that might be kfira.
Hashem is here, Hashem is there.
Right, well that's Chassidus. That's for sure kfira. That's kfira, you don't need the Rambam for that. I mean, Tzaddik would hold that's Hashem Echad. Okay, I want to go into
but to say that, Hashem is everywhere is, let's say.
That's Chassidus. I mean, that's Chassidus. In other words,
I'm not saying so, just say anything.
After the Gili Azaya, a person, of course you say Hashem is there is everywhere, because according to Rabbi Tzaddik, that's Hashem Echad, that's called Hashem Echad, you give him the base in Shabbos, that's Rabbi Tzaddik's understanding of that.
Right,
yeah.
but for a kid, for a child, I mean, how would the Rambam tell you to teach a child today?
I have no idea. Okay. Maybe a child is not patam in a mitzvahs anyway, so maybe, can a child be a kaifel? Actually, kind of Chaim Brisker can be, because if it's called the Cheptz of Apikeres, a child can be a kaifer too. According to Chaim Brisker, according to Chaim Brisker, a brisker kaifer, a child can be a brisker kaifer. No, a child can be a kaifer, it can be a brisker kaifer. Those of you who enjoyed my term brisker woman will say there's a brisker kaifer, and the mice a kid that's like even a few months old can be a brisker kaifer. Now, how would he be brisker? No, he can't speak, but as soon as the child starts speaking at 3 years old, and says God is there, he's a brisker, God is here, he's a brisker kaifer, and then you should put him to death. Chas v'shalom.
A brisker death.
A brisker death. Okay. Okay, fine. Okay, now, what I want to do now is I want to commence now with chapter 61. Okay? Now, chapter 61 begins a very, very interesting topic, which is in fact going to occupy us for a while, and in fact actually raises a very, very fundamental issue about the entire Moreh Nevuchim, the entire Garfield perplexed. It becomes much more, the Rambam actually explicitly discusses this later on in Chelik Gimel when he speaks about the Tamei HaMitzvahs, but already now the Rambam is actually going to give an accounting for this. Namely, the following question is, all of these interesting ideas, all these philosophical ideas, these abstract ideas, where do they come from? Do they come from the Chumash? Or do they come from Aristotle? Well, let me perhaps explain this a little bit differently. The Rambam certainly, in this reading of Psukim, the Psukim, for example, the Pashas Kisisa, and the Kadosh Baruch Hu's dialogue with Moshe Rabbeinu, so then the Rambam has certainly, in other words, interpreted the Psukim, right, as indicating that Moshe Rabbeinu's understanding of God vis-a-vis the Rambam's negative theology was at the highest level ever reached by any person. The Rambam says, Moshe Rabbeinu Shlomo HaMelech. Those psukim go very, very well. The Rambam's interpretation was very convincing. A beautiful pages. We spent shiurim on that. However, there are other parts of the Chumash that don't somehow reconcile themselves with the Rambam's negative theology. Names of God. Right? This is the Bible critic's paradise. In other words, unfortunately, many people, like Nebuch, read the Chumash and think that, that monotheism is a recent invention. And Chas v'Shalom, this is kfira, this is minas and kfira, this is something that we reject absolutely. The question is, when the Chumash appears to be using things like names of God, how are we to understand this in light of the Rambam's negative theology? Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Klal Yisrael, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, Baruch Hu, which name should I tell them? Which name should I tell them? What does that mean? So these are questions which the Rambam ultimately has to face. In other words, if the Rambam is presenting us with the authentic belief and philosophy of Judaism as it has always existed from the Chumash, which he has to, because if not, he just made something up and let's suppose the Moreh Nevuchim go somewhere else. Is that important for the Rambam? For the Rambam to convince me that abstract philosophy, this is the proper way to think about God, I accept it rationally. But I need more than that. Is this the religion of my forefathers? Elokeinu v'lekei Aviseinu. Everybody knows the famous word. I know who says it, I'm sure everybody says it. That Elokeinu means, Elokeinu v'Aviseinu means there's two aspects of God. There's the God that you discover for yourself, Elokeinu, and the God of the Tati, the God of your father. I mean, it's essential that the God of the Rambam also be the God of Holy Yankov, of Moshe Rabbeinu. If this is not the God of the Tati, of the Zaydir, so the Rambam is basically undoing the entire Jewish faith, because it's critical to the Jewish faith to have historical authenticity and truth. In other words, no one could possibly suggest that the basic philosophical theology of Judaism is something which didn't exist in biblical times, but was only later developed under the influence of Greek philosophy. I mean, that's something that Orthodox Judaism violently rejects. So, what the Rambam has to do is he has to make an argument and show us that everything he's saying about HaKadosh Baruch Hu was said in the Chumash, was said by Moshe Rabbeinu. If not, then let's close the Sefer and we'll just learn Kant together. Or something close to Kant, whatever. I think we slug them up. So anyway. This is, in my opinion, the most complex part of the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, this is more complicated with the Rambam, because the Rambam does say that when Klal Yisrael got out of Mitzrayim, the Jews came out of Egypt, they were steeped in idolatrous culture. I mean, the Rambam has to acknowledge that, in fact, the Hamoinam, the common folk, as we spoke about in chapter 26, had idolatrous notions. Which means that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Moshe Rabbeinu, is particularly they are the people to whom we have to attribute the true philosophical concept of God, the way the Rambam presents it in the Moreh Nevuchim. So, in other words, it's going to be very important for the Rambam in understanding as Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to Klal Yisrael, how he's invoking the name of God and proving to us, or at least making it at least understandable, that and convincing that Moshe Rabbeinu's notion of God as he speaks to Klal Yisrael is the same notion of God as the Rambam is presenting here in the Moreh Nevuchim. So that's a very, very important part of the Sefer. Okay? Now, so with this, we commence with chapter 61, Perek Samach Aleph, which is on page 155 in the Shavuot edition. Says the Rambam. Let's begin chapter 61 now. And this is actually the Rambam's first venture into what I call theological anthropology. I don't know if that's actually an official department in any university, but I'm coining the term, or anthropological theology? No, I think theological anthropology. In other words, the history of theology. No, the theology of anthropology? No. You don't like the term? Anthropological theology? Theological anthropology?
What is it supposed to represent?
I want to speak the history of the concept of God as men understand God. The history of man is anthropology, right?
Developmental theology, kind of thing.
Not like developmental theology. I want it for because the Rambam understands that the concept of God, how it's connected with man throughout history. I can't say theological anthropology.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay, well, we're going to try a new term. If someone objects to this, then then we'll change the name, especially if you give us a grant, we'll certainly change the name. Theological anthropology means, theological anthropology just means, we'll speak about theology and anthropology. Theology and anthropology, okay? Well, that's a compromise, theology. Theological anthropology really means theology and anthropology. Like, political science means it's politics that make it into a science. There's no science of politics. So the same thing too, okay? We don't have any, right? Okay, fine. Says the Rambam, Parak Sabach Aleph, page 155 of the 4th edition. Kol Shemaisav is Allah HaMitzuya B'Kisvei HaKodesh, all names of God that appear in the Holy Scriptures. Kulam Gzurim Mimaisem. All of them come from God's acts. In other words, all of them are based on God's acts. In other words, don't think that when the Chumash uses a name of God, it's referring to God. It's referring to an act of God. Zed Davar Yadua. This is known. And Davar Yadua means this is known, certainly if you read the Moreh Nevuchim. It has to be so. Zula Shem Echad. But there's one name that in fact actually doesn't refer to a God's act. It was very, very important. Because if every name in the Chumash refers to an act of God, so the Rambam's negative theology, God's impenetrable existence, right, cannot be traced to the Chumash. He made up. The Moreh Nevuchim was made up in the 12th century. I mean, Rambam made up Jewish theology in the 12th century. In other words, the Rambam has to make an argument to us that his negative theology exists in the Chumash. How is he going to do this? Well, the Chumash contains many names of God. So the Rambam says like this: every name of God is a description of his action. But there's one name of God that says about God what I've been saying to you in all these chapters of theology. What is that? That's Yud Kei Vav Kei. In other words, the Rambam is saying everything I've said to you in all these chapters of theology, the Chumash has a name for God that implies everything about God. Everything I've told you was known, and that's Yud Kei Vav Kei. Kishem Prati Lo Yisala, because it's actually a proper name of God. It's not describe God's. It doesn't describe anything in the world. It's not a description of anything in the world. It's not an act of God, but it's actually a proper name of God. Yud Kei Vav is a name of God. Chaynu Nikra, for this reason, is called Shem Mefurish, the explicit name of God. Now, Mefurish means explicit name of God. Some people call it the ineffable name of God. You can't say it. The Maisa, you can't say it either. We have no Maser saying it. But in other words, the Rambam calls it this is the explicit name of God. Perish Hadafa. What does it mean to say when we give God a name? Now, very interesting. Giving God a name usually is a positive attribute. How can you give God a name which is a positive attribute? According to the Rambam, you can't give God a positive attribute. In fact, you can't even pretend to give him a positive attribute, even for educational purposes, because the Rambam said that's already a very dangerous idea, a very dangerous practice. So therefore, what does Yud Kei Vav Kei mean? Yud Kei Vav Kei is a name which connotes God's essence in a way in which you cannot, in fact, describe it in a positive sense. That's what it means. In other words, everything, or every idea that I've been speaking about over these last chapters, that's implied, or that's referred to by the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. Sha'ah Shemayim is Hamafarim, says the Rambam on page 156. Other names which glorify God, Luma Zois, the contradiction to this, Meirim B'Shitov. They certainly use terms which in fact actually involve perfections and positive attributes as we know them. Why is this true? And why is this allowed? Because they actually come from acts. They're describing acts of God. And these acts of God, that the Rambam says, are acts that are similar to acts that people do. And because of that, you can actually describe God by description of these acts. That's what we explained above. In other words, we explained above that we've spoken about this. The Rambam has said several times that one may describe God by describing his acts. So the names of God are not proper names of God, but they're names which describe his acts. But there is one name which in fact actually properly describes God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and it's not a description of God, Chas v'Shalom, but rather it's a reference to the entire theological discussion of negative theology which we've had up to now heretofore in the Geifer place. Okay, I'm going to stop over here because we're just beginning, and this is a good introduction. It's good that I began this, so now you'll believe me when I said that in chapter 61 he's going to speak about positive, at least seemingly positive attributes, why chapter 60 was sort of like this, tread gingerly. In any case, we're going to get to a very, very difficult and complex part of the Moreh Nevuchim. The Rambam is actually going to go very deeply into biblical theology, and we're going to find that to be a very enlightening and challenging subject matter. Until then, from the undisclosed place in Yerushalayim, Kol Tuv.